All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling something pretty thought-provoking, cultural relativism.
Oh, yeah.
You sent over some really fascinating sources on this, and I gotta say, I'm already hooked, especially by this question. Can we really truly accept every cultural practice out there, even the ones that, well, seem harmful?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's find out.
Well, it's a question that has puzzled, philosophers, anthropologists, really for ages.
Mm-hmm.
And to even start unpacking it, we have to understand what cultural relativism actually means. It's this idea that to really get another culture, you got to look at it through their lens, not your own.
Okay, yeah, I get that. It's like you can't judge a fish for not being able to climb a tree.
Exactly.
Each culture has its own environment, its own ways of adapting.
Yeah. And a great example of that is actually from the work of Franz Boas, who's considered, the father of American anthropology. He studied the Inuit people of the Arctic, and he realized that their culture, while like so different from Western society,
Mhm.
was perfectly adapted to their environment, to that harsh environment. He showed that instead of seeing cultures as like primitive or advanced, we need to appreciate how each one solves the challenges they face.
So Boas kind of shifted the focus from judging cultures to understanding them on their own terms. Makes sense. But how does this all play out in terms of morality? Does cultural relativism mean there's no such thing as right and wrong?
That's where things get really interesting. Cultural relativism introduces this concept called moral pluralism, meaning there isn't one universal set of morals. What's considered right or wrong can vary like drastically between cultures.
Okay, so like picture this. In one culture, it's super rude to make direct eye contact. But in another, it's like a sign of respect. Is one right and the other wrong? Or are they just different ways of expressing, social cues?
It's exactly. Cultural relativism encourages us to see those differences not as right or wrong, but as diverse expressions of human behavior.
Mm.
This approach has been so important, especially in the post-colonial era, where it helped to challenge the idea that Western culture was somehow superior and should be imposed on everybody else.
Oh, that's a really important point. For centuries, colonization was justified by this whole idea that certain cultures were like backward
Yeah.
and needed to be, civilized according
Yeah.
to Western standards. Cultural relativism pushes back against that. It's saying, hold on, different doesn't mean inferior.
Right. It's about recognizing the value and the dignity of each culture, even if their practices seem strange or unfamiliar to us. And this leads to one of the most appealing aspects of cultural relativism, its emphasis on tolerance and understanding. By embracing these cultural differences, the idea is we can reduce prejudice and discrimination, leading to a more peaceful and interconnected world.
I love that idea, promoting tolerance. But I can also see how things could get tricky when you're dealing with practices that seem harmful. That's where I imagine some of the criticisms of cultural relativism start to come in.
You're absolutely right. This emphasis on understanding, however, also raises concerns about the potential to condone harmful practices.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront a very difficult question. If all cultural practices are equally valid, how do we address those that violate human rights?
That's a tough one, for sure. And our sources bring up some really heavy examples, like
Mhm.
uh, female genital mutilation, honor killings, even slavery. These practices that have been defended as, like, cultural traditions.
Mm.
Even though they cause so much suffering, it feels like a real moral dilemma.
Yeah, it really is. And that's why critics of like pure cultural relativism argue that it can lead to this kind of moral paralysis.
Moral paralysis.
Yeah. Like if we say that every cultural practice is equally valid, then where do we draw the line? How can we condemn something like slavery, even if it was, once a widespread cultural norm?
Okay, so if I'm hearing you right, the problem isn't necessarily understanding the cultural context of a practice, but it's figuring out when that understanding turns into acceptance and potentially overlooking some serious harm.
Exactly. Yeah, you got it. That's the core of the debate. Take female genital mutilation, for instance, or FGM, as it's often called, the practice that's rooted in these, cultural beliefs
Yeah.
about purity and marriageability. But it also carries some really severe physical and psychological consequences for women.
Right.
So does understanding the cultural context, meaning that we just accept it, even if it violates,
All of
a
them.
woman's basic right to bodily integrity.
It feels impossible to reconcile those two things. But our sources do offer some alternative approaches. One that stood out to me was this idea of cultural sensitivity with limits. Can you unpack that one a bit?
Absolutely. This approach encourages us to really strive for understanding. Why does a practice exist? What social or historical factors contribute to it? But, and this is key, We don't have to condone the practice or accept it as harmless. We can acknowledge its cultural significance without ignoring the potential for harm.
So it's like saying, okay, I can see why this is important to you, but I also have to acknowledge that it causes suffering, and that's something we need to address. It's more like a starting point for a dialogue
Yeah.
than like a final answer.
Exactly. It's about navigating that tension between, you know, understanding and accountability. Another perspective our sources bring up is the idea of universalism with flexibility.
Okay.
So maybe there's some universal values, things like the right to life, freedom from torture, just basic human dignity. That should apply across all cultures.
But wouldn't that clash with the whole idea of cultural relativism, where morality is relative?
It is a tricky balance. But proponents of this view argue that even if there are these, universal values, we still need to apply them with sensitivity to cultural differences. Maybe there are different ways to achieve those values, different like cultural expressions of those core principles.
So instead of imposing this like one-size-fits-all solution, you would work with each culture to find ways to uphold those values within their own context. That sounds like it would take a lot of open communication.
And collaboration.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Our sources really emphasize that dialogue is key. Instead of just dictating what's right or wrong, we should engage in respectful conversations, especially with those most affected by potentially harmful practices. It's about finding solutions together rather than just, imposing them from the outside.
That makes me think about like international human rights laws.
Yeah.
There's often tension between upholding those universal rights and respecting cultural practices.
Right.
Have you seen any examples of how this actually plays out? Definitely. Think about the debates around women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights, even freedom of religion. Some countries argue that certain international standards conflict with their cultural or religious beliefs. And it really highlights that challenge of finding a balance between respecting diversity and protecting those fundamental human rights.
There's just so much to consider here. But what I'm taking away from all of this is that cultural relativism is a powerful tool for understanding, but it's not a simple answer to these complex ethical questions. It's more about like starting a conversation, ending one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that this isn't just, some abstract philosophical debate. These are dilemmas that can and do pop up in our everyday lives. Think about traveling to a new country with totally different customs, or even interacting with people from different backgrounds in your own community.
Yeah, that's a great point. We're constantly navigating those cultural differences, trying to be respectful without, compromising our own values. So how can our listeners actually apply these ideas to their own lives?
Yeah, it can be a real balancing act. On the one hand, you don't want to be that person who's like constantly judging other cultures based on, their own limited worldview. But you also don't want to just accept practices that go against your own, sense of ethics, especially if they involve harm.
Right.
It's a constant process
Sure.
of learning and reflecting and engaging in, thoughtful dialogue. And sometimes it means confronting our own cultural blind spots.
Yeah.
We all have them. Those things we consider normal. That might seem strange or even offensive to someone from a different background.
That's so true. I'm trying to think of like examples from my own culture that someone else might find perplexing or even like harmful. It makes you realize how much we just take for granted.
It really does. It's a great exercise. And to help you ponder that a bit more, let's end this deep dive with a thought-provoking question for you, the listener.
Okay, hit me with it.
Think about one cultural practice from your own culture that someone from a completely different background might view as harmful or strange.
Ooh, wow. That is a powerful question. It really makes you step outside yourself.
It does, right.
And see things through a new lens.
Yeah, maybe it's something related to food, clothing, social customs, maybe even like deeply held beliefs. Whatever it is, take some time to reflect on it. Why is this practice important in your culture? And how might it be perceived by someone who doesn't share that same cultural background?
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a whole new framework for thinking about, cultural differences.
Yeah.
Both the beauty and the challenges they present.
Me too. And I hope our listeners feel empowered to, continue this exploration on their own. Maybe even have a conversation with friends or family about that thought-provoking question we posed. It could lead to some really fascinating insights.
Absolutely. Cultural relativism is such a complex and fascinating topic, and this deep dive has given us all a lot to think about. So thanks for guiding us through this. It's been a real pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll see you next time for another deep dive. into a thought-provoking topic.